So, as you know, there's a fair amount of disagreement about whether anthropogenic climate change is real or not. And that form of denial is largely identified with the Republican side of the aisle in American politics. So what I want to suggest is sort of the setup for this talk is that there's also been denial on the other side of the aisle, a sort of distinct type of denial, but a type of denial nonetheless. On the Republican side, the denial has been about the science. But on the Democratic side, I would say it's been about the economics, some of the economic implications of a serious policy to address climate change, which, as I'll suggest in a moment, would include the pricing of carbon emissions. And that denial, I think, has been driven above all by phobia about the T word in American politics. The fact that taxes are so politically unpopular has, I think, helped to motivate some of the Democratic cognitive dissonance or dissembling about the economic impacts of climate policy. Some of you may remember, for example, in the 2008 presidential campaign, as the summer campaigning season rolled around, gas prices in the United States hit a fairly high point, and there was a lot of concern about how that was impacting hard-pressed American families. And both Hillary Clinton and John McCain, both of whom were in the race at that point, both of whom were proponents of a cap-and-trade policy to address climate change, both of them called for a federal gas tax holiday to relieve the hard-pressed American families who were excessively burdened by the federal gas tax, which, as many of you will know, hasn't been changed in 2 decades and is about 18 cents a gallon. The disconnect between believing that 18 cents a gallon on gas was an intolerable burden for Americans to face during the summer of 2008, and the claim that they were in favor of addressing the problem of climate change went largely unnoticed in the American press and media, as far as I could see, although to me it was just sort of a revealing demonstration, I think, of the second form of denial, the denial of some of the economic implications of climate policy. Broadly speaking, we can think of 2 broad types of policies to address carbon emissions and climate change. One set of policies aims to reduce the demand for fossil fuels. So the way economists think of that, of course, is that at any given price, the quantity demanded would be lower. And investments in energy efficiency, renewables, mass transit, etc., all are what you might think of as demand-side policies that would reduce our use of fossil fuels at any given price. In addition, there are policies on the supply side that seek to raise the price of fossil fuels. So given any demand schedule, higher prices push demand up that schedule and reduce the quantity demanded. And those policies can take 2 broad forms. One's a cap and permit policy, and the other's a carbon tax. Why do we need, as I believe, supply-side policies as part of the policy mix? I don't want to suggest that supply-side policies are the only kind of policies we need, but I think in climate policy, as in many matters, it's useful to think about walking on 2 legs, and in this case, the 2 legs are both the demand side and the supply side. I think one of the important reasons why we need a supply side policy, that is to say a policy that raises the price of fossil fuels substantially enough to reduce consumption of them, is that, if we see this as an urgent problem, and I believe it is an urgent problem, we need to act quickly rather than slowly. And demand-side policies take time. Some of them take quite a bit of time. I mean, think about developing mass transit systems to get all those commuters around Metro Boston or any other big American city off the road, or most of them off the road. That's not something you're going to snap your fingers and do in a month or a year, maybe even a decade. It's going to take time. And in the meantime, we need to start reducing carbon emissions. The second reason for supply-side policy is, of course, that in a mixed enterprise economy like that of the United States, in which roughly 3/4 of energy sector investment is private sector investment rather than public sector investment, one needs to have price signals that will direct that private sector investment towards energy efficiency and the production of renewables, the shift to a clean energy economy. So the supply side policies that raise prices not only have quick effects on our use of fossil fuels, but also help to create the incentive structure that will stimulate the demand side investments in the private sector in particular, on which the energy transition ultimately is going to depend. As I mentioned, the price instrument can be affected either via a carbon tax or via a cap, and to a large extent these are equivalent, although if you read the economic literature or indeed listen to the discourses among many politicians and policymakers, and enviros for that matter, you would think this is a major battle line between tax versus a cap. But in practice, you can think of a tax as setting a price for carbon permits and allowing the quantity of those permits to vary, and a cap as setting the quantity of carbon permits and allowing the price to vary. So that, it's a question of which one's varying. In both cases, as most of you know, but just to make clear what we're talking about, a permit here is a permit to emit 1 ton of carbon or 1 ton of CO2, they can be constructed either way, into the atmosphere. Or actually the way most of them are structured, the permit is to bring that ton of carbon into the US economy. You have an upstream system, so the permits are required at the points where the coal, oil, or natural gas enters the economy, at the mine head, at the pipeline terminal, the tanker terminal, etc. To my mind, whether we have a tax or a cap is not in and of itself a huge issue. I tend to be more sympathetic, I suppose, lean a little bit towards the cap, for the simple reason that what matters really is which is our most important target. Is our target to hit a certain price on carbon, or is our target to hit a certain quantity of carbon emissions? In the case of climate policy, it seems to me that the quantity target is the overriding target. It's the aim of the policy. There is a certain amount of uncertainty. That's sort of a paradox. There is uncertainty about the relationship between the price and the quantity. We have fairly good estimates that in the short run, the price elasticity of demand for fossil fuels is around 0.3, so a 10% increase in the price would generate about a 3% reduction in the quantity demanded. But over the medium and the long term, there are a lot of imponderables about this, and moreover, the demand for carbon is going to depend, among other things, on where we are in the business cycle. In a boom time, you'd have a different price than in a bust time if you fix the quantity. Whereas if you fix the tax, it's the quantity of emissions that would be allowed to fluctuate around. But as I say, I think it's a secondary issue, and I regret actually how much this has divided people who should, in fact, be allies in the struggle to create carbon policy. As a little brief foray into economic theory, the problem of carbon emissions is an example, a kind of global example, of what economists and scholars of jurisprudence call an open access problem. That is to say, the right to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is not a right over which there is any structure of property rights, or in many cases even controls. It's the problem that sometimes is somewhat misleadingly called the tragedy of the commons, because that was the title that Garrett Hardin used for it in his famous piece in 1968 in Science magazine. But as Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years ago, to the chagrin of many economists, but to my delight, because she was a political scientist and not a quote-unquote real economist, that accounts for both the chagrin and the delight. As she devoted really much of her career to demonstrating, there are many cases across history and across societies where communities and social groups have managed to successfully govern the commons through various sorts of common property resource management arrangements that have prevented the tragedy that Hardin warned against, which is overuse of the common resource and ultimate ecological collapses resulting from that. So open access is, I think, a better term to use. Carbon pricing, whether done via a tax or done via a cap, basically converts what has hitherto been an open access resource into property. To some degree it becomes property. Property is not an either or binary category. Either you've got fully developed property rights or you don't. Real property exists in the intermediate space between perfectly defined, secure, enforceable property rights and open access. And putting a cap or a tax on emissions involves property creation. Since this is a pricing strategy, it not only means that people would pay to be putting carbon into the atmosphere, but it also means that people would be paid. If somebody's paying, on the other end of the transaction, somebody else is paid. And the question on which I want to really focus with you folks this afternoon is who gets paid, or to think of it another way in terms of this movement towards creating property rights, who are the rightful owners of the sink functions of the environment, in this case, our share of the world's ability to put carbon into the biosphere. The higher fossil fuel prices from this perspective that would result from carbon pricing represent payment of rent for use of the carbon sink. So thinking about this in terms of property creation, we start out at open access where there are no property rights. Conventional regulatory standards, which economists somewhat disparagingly often refer to as command and control regulations, in an effort to evoke Soviet central planning, people produce 100,000 left shoes and no right shoes and so on, right? Regulatory standards, which are the conventional and still major instrument for environmental policy in this country, represent to some extent some creation of property rights. There's no longer open access. The society creates rules that restrict and govern that access. Price-based regulation moves that property creation dimension of environmental policy further along the spectrum. Because in this case, there are not only rules regarding access to the resource, but those who have access have to pay for that access. So in the conventional regulatory standard approach, the polluters have to pay something. They have to pay for the abatement costs that are compelled by the regulation. Installation of scrubbers and the smokestacks would be an example of that. In the case of price-based regulation, the polluters not only have to pay for abatement costs, but they also have to pay for the emissions that they do not abate. They have to pay for their pollution, in other words. So, for example, under the sulfur dioxide trading scheme introduced in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, the earlier command and control type regulatory framework for SO2 emissions from power plants in the United States was supplemented with, or building upon that was added, a system whereby permits were created. Those permits had value, and the polluters in some sense had to pay for those permits. I say in some sense because most of the permits were given away for free, a process which I try to avoid using this word because I've reached a sort of stage in life where I recognize that it is both ageist and sexist, but the term that's used for it is grandfathering. You can find an objection, right? But for giving away valuable permits to corporations, they call that grandfathering. I'm offended. But anyway, that's the term that's used. But even if the permits are given away for free, they have value, and the decision of a firm not to sell the permit, but instead to retain it in order to be able to put a ton of SO2 into the atmosphere, in this case, represents, in effect, them paying a price, foregoing the value that that permit has on the market. In terms of the bundle of sticks that constitute property right, a metaphor often used in the jurisprudence literature, we can think of regulatory standards as being about the bundle of the sticks in the bundle that regulate access to the resource. And we can think about price-based regulation as adding not only the stick of regulation, but also the stick that involves the right to receive income or rent from use of that asset. So to think with you a little bit about the economics of this is a slide that will, in effect, provide kind of a stylized description of AB 32 implementation in the state of California. AB 32 is the California Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, under which the California legislature mandated fairly, substantial reductions in California's carbon emissions, and left it up to the California Air Resources Board, California EPA, to figure out how to achieve that. And the policies that CARB and Cal EPA came up with involve a mix of regulatory instruments and price-based instruments. These are not, an either-or choice. You can have both, and in most cases where we have price-based instruments, we also have regulations. The regulations say what is legal, and the prices are what you have to pay to do what is legal. And there are a lot of things that happen in the economy that involve that combination. So under the plan that was developed by the California authorities, approximately a 12% reduction in California's carbon emissions, reduction below the baseline year, will be achieved through what you could think of as those conventional regulatory means. Renewable portfolio standards, low carbon fuel standards, et cetera, et cetera. But the overall envelope set by the legislature was a larger reduction. It was a reduction to 16%. And that remaining reduction is to be achieved through the implementation of a cap and trade system. So this is a cap-based approach to the price side of the regulatory environment. And so now on the horizontal axis we have the emissions price, and economists expect that when you put a price on emissions, what you will find is that firms and households, because households are affected by the rising prices as well when they're heating their homes or air conditioning their homes or driving their cars or whatever, they will choose the least cost ways of abating their emissions first, and they will abate up to the point where it's cheaper to pay the tax or buy the permit or not sell the permit if it was given to them for free. And so the marginal abatement cost curve is shown here. And the cap, which is designed to produce a 16% total reduction in emissions by the year 2020, would result in a price on carbon emissions of roughly, the California Air Resources Board projection is that it'll be about $37 per ton of CO2 in 2020. So that little triangle there is what's called the resource cost. That's the cost to society of achieving that reduction in emissions. The costs of the insulation in homes or the purchase of more energy efficient vehicles or what have you that allows you to reduce your emissions to achieve that 16% level. That's the real cost of achieving the emissions reduction. And of course, if you cut emissions even further, you push not only the total cost, but also the marginal cost higher. The critical point is that in addition to that resource cost, we have the resource rent. In other words, the 84% of California's CO2 emissions that are not abated as a result of the combination of regulatory and price-based policies will all carry a higher price, right? And that additional price is the $37 a ton embodied and passed through to consumers, as we'll talk about in a moment, multiplied by the tons of carbon that are still being emitted. And so that's the rectangle here. And as you will see, that rectangle is considerably bigger than the little triangle, the resource cost of the reductions in carbon emissions. So this is the rent. And one thing that many folks don't understand, probably many of you do, but a lot of people don't, including a lot of politicians, a lot of environmentalists, even a lot of policymakers, as far as I can find out, is the difference between the cost and the transfer. That confusion was on display during the debate over the last failed effort to introduce a cap-and-trade policy at the national level, the Waxman-Markey bill. The Congressional Budget Office came up with a study, and it estimated that around 2020, the cost to American households of the Waxman-Markey implementation would be about 18 cents per person a day, less than the cost of a postage stamp was the phrase that was used in the media, right? That was a calculation of the resource cost, that little triangle, right? And so, you know, the Democrats said, look, this is really cheap, you know, how can we not do this? It's only 18 cents a day per person, you know, big deal. Meanwhile, John Boehner, the Republican Speaker of the House, said passing this bill would be equivalent to imposing the biggest tax increase on the American people in history. Now, that may be a little bit of political hyperbole, but what Boehner was talking about really was the increase in prices for fossil fuels that would result from the cap-and-trade program. He wasn't talking specifically about that resource cost. He was also talking about the amount that people would pay in higher prices. And the Republicans said, oh, no, it's not a tax, it's a cap. You know, well, that already is sort of, you know, blowing a little bit of smoke on the picture. And they said, it's only 18 cents a day. Look at this CBO study, as if there was no difference between the triangle and the rectangle here, right? Now, maybe they just didn't understand it. Maybe they were being disingenuous, maybe a bit of both. But in this case, you know, I would say just because a Republican says it doesn't mean it's wrong. When Boehner describes this as a big tax increase, it is. It is. Face it, it is. And for the Democrats to run away from that and hide behind this confusion between the resource cost and the resource rent is, well, that's that climate economics denial that I was talking about at the beginning. The multi-billion-dollar question that comes up in climate policy then is who gets that money? Who will get that rent? Will it be the firms? Will it be the government? Will it be the people? If nothing else that you come away with from this talk, if you come away just to understand the difference between abatement cost and the resource rent transfer, you will have an insight into climate policy that will put you in, you know, light years ahead of most environmentalists, politicians, etc. So, before we get into who gets the money, let's just think a little bit about who pays. The usual assumption is that 100% of the value of the permits or the cost of the tax will be passed through to consumers. So people will pay in proportion to their carbon footprints. It doesn't matter whether the permits are auctioned or given away under a cap system. Sometimes the firms will claim, oh, if you give us the permits for free, we won't have to raise prices, right? Well, as Dan Rather once said in a 60-minute show years ago, I never forgot the phrase, if you'll believe that, you'll believe rocks grow. Now actually, maybe some rocks do, I don't know. But believe me, if you reduce supply, the price goes up. If we gave away tickets to the World Series, say we gave them to ExxonMobil, do you think we'd all be able to go to the World Series for free? I don't think so. You know, there's scarcity that creates rent. The cost is passed along to the consumers unless in a rather special case, the firm is prevented from doing so by some sort of price regulation. That, in practical terms, is relevant mainly in the case of electric power. If you give away permits to electric utilities, and if electricity pricing is regulated by a state public utilities commission, it is possible that the electric utilities would not pass on the value of those permits to the consumer. Would that insulate consumers from the pocketbook consequences of having a carbon cap? No, it wouldn't insulate it. The cap is still the cap. What it would do is it would dim or totally wipe out the price signal that motivates reductions in consumption. And so you would not get the reductions in electricity use that the price signal would otherwise have engendered, you've still got the cap, you've still got certain emissions reductions to achieve. So what it means is that you'd have to get bigger reductions from other sectors, notably transportation fuels. So the consumers would still pay, they'd just pay more in terms of higher gas prices than in terms of higher electricity bills. The money ultimately comes from the consumers. Price signal suppression would mean that the incentives are not being transmitted through the system, and the cap would force commensurately higher prices in other sectors that are not affected by this price signal compression. So, you know, repressing the price signal alters the composition of emissions reductions, but it doesn't change the overall magnitude of reductions. It's something that electricity utilities are very keen to see as price signal compression. When I was on the Economic and Allocation Advisory Committee to the California state government, when we were advising mainly about how to distribute permits and what to do with the rent, we had California has an open meeting law, and at all these meetings, the public, there was a certain period for the public to make comments. And if you were a Martian and dropped in on one of those meetings, you would conclude that 90% of the people of California worked for electric utilities. Because they were so present at these meetings and so on top of it. And ultimately, they were more influential than our committee was in affecting certain parts of the policy that came out. Which consumers? Well, because fuels are necessities rather than luxuries, what you find is that although, of course, as households become more affluent and consume more, that's what being affluent is about, they have bigger carbon footprints. The line is not perfectly linear, it's concave. As we know, low-income households spend a somewhat higher percentage of their family budgets on fuel needs than do wealthier families. And so that concavity means that the carbon, the distributional impact of carbon pricing, of the carbon tax, as Maynard would forthrightly call it, is actually a regressive tax. In other words, it takes a higher percentage bite out of the incomes of low-income households than of upper-income households. So it's a matter of distributional concern in thinking about the implications of the policy. The recommendations that we put forward in the California committee, the Economic Allocation Advisory Committee that I mentioned, were that the allowances or permits should be auctioned rather than given away for free, that a very small share of allowances might be given away for free to energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. That California is just one state, and there was some concern for some industries, petroleum refining being the most important of these, that the carbon pricing in California would render them uncompetitive, industries would move out of state, California jobs would be lost, but there would be no reduction in carbon emissions. There would be this phenomenon called carbon leakage. So we opened the door a crack in our recommendations to make adjustments to the policy for that purpose. Unfortunately, of course, if you open the door a crack, sometimes an elephant can walk through. We recommended that of the revenue from auctioning close to 100% of the permits, we reckon you could make a case for maybe giving away about 2% in total. We recommended that 75% of that allowance value should be returned to households directly, either in the form of per capita dividends or cuts in income and sales taxes. There was a division of opinion in the committee about that. Since many of you are economists, let me just say parenthetically that the argument for rebating it via the tax system was that this would produce the so-called double dividend, that when people were able to retain a greater share of their income, they would be willing to increase their labor supply, and that would increase output down the road. That might be a persuasive argument if California ever had anything close to a full employment economy, but of course California has chronic unemployment like most countries in most states. The idea that by cutting income and sales taxes, you're going to increase labor supply, and that's going to have some, significant effect on California's GDP in 30 years. I believe is just a complete fallacy, frankly. And some of us advocated for dividends on the grounds that these were a more politically visible way to rebate the money. Rebating the money via the tax system is kind of like putting it into the electric bill, the way that I was talking about. You can tell people, oh, your taxes would have been higher if you hadn't had the rebate, but who can understand what goes into calculation of their taxes? Whereas, as I'll show in a moment, if you provide the money directly to households and families, it's very clear who's getting. Let me just mention the last point. We also advocated that about 25% of the money should go into public investment and expenditures and things like community benefit funds for disadvantaged communities. Looking at the net impact of such a policy in California on household incomes, these are estimates done by my colleague on the committee, Dan Cameron, who heads the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley, and one of his graduate students, Kathy Kunkel, that looked at the relationship between the percentage of allowance value that would be rebated to the public in the form of dividends and the percentage of households that would come out as net winners, that is to say what they got back as their dividend would exceed what they paid at higher prices. And you can see if you get the dividends up to 75%, you're in a situation where you've got something on the order of 2/3 of the California households at the end of the day are getting more back through dividends than they're paying in higher prices. The reason for that being that, of course, income is concentrated and expenditure is concentrated at the high end of the system. It's a skewed distribution, and so the median is different from the mean in terms of the net effect. So there you've got it. That's what we expected would happen if that policy were implemented. So in terms of, these are my last few slides, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for discussion. In terms of the options with respect to disposition of the carbon rent, of the value created through carbon pricing, either through a cap or through a tax. I've used cap here, but you could instead substitute the term fee. Fee is the euphemism for cap that's often used. That doesn't fool Republicans, by the way. So one possibility is cap and giveaway and trade. I insert giveaway in the middle here because although the term cap and trade has become so widely used that most people kind of see them as inextricably joined at the hip, the only reason why trading of permits is part, or has to be part, of a permit policy is that if you give the permits away through one of these disgracefully termed grandfathering systems, on the basis of some more or less arbitrary formula, usually involving historic emissions, so those who polluted more get more free permits, you need to have a trading scheme, or at least there's a very good case for having a trading scheme on economic grounds, because some will be able to reduce emissions more cheaply than others, and those who can do so will sell off permit to those for whom emissions reductions are expensive, et cetera, et cetera. So the need for permit trading arises from the initial decision to give away the permits. That results in windfall profits for the recipients of the free permits because they pass along the prices unless prevented from doing so by a public utilities commission. The profits from those payments by the consumers of the highest prices are ultimately, you can think of them as being distributed to households, more or less in proportion to their ownership of energy company stocks. There's a substantial amount of that ownership which is foreign, so it leaks out of state or out of the country. And in effect, it assigns the newly created property rights, the rights we were talking about earlier, to receive the income to the firms that receive the permits. A second possibility is cap and spend, or fee and spend. In this case, the permits are auctioned, or the taxes are imposed, and the revenues go to the government, and the proceeds are used for whatever purpose the government chooses to use them. That could be to cut taxes. One candidate that gets some support is cutting corporate income taxes. Another possibility is that can be used to fund various sorts of expenditures. Those could be expenditures on healthcare, education, environmental protection, the Pentagon, you name it. You ask people how they feel about it, it's kind of a Rorschach test of how they feel about the government. People who hate the government hate this idea. People who like the government like this idea. I won't even go into the cognitive dissonance in American politics, where liberals like the government in theory but hate it in practice, and Republicans hate it in theory but like it in practice. That arises from the fact that most of the government is the military. In effect, this assigns the newly created property rights to the government. And the third possibility, and the one that I've already talked a little bit about, is what's called cap and dividend, or in the case of a carbon tax, it's called fee and dividend. That's what the climate scientist James Hansen has been a big proponent of. And in this case, the permits are auctioned, not given away, or the tax is collected. And instead of remaining in the hands of the government, the revenues are recycled equally to every person in the country, based on the philosophical principle that we all own in common and equal measure our nation's share of the carbon sink, the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the biosphere. One of the politically attractive, indeed in my mind compelling features of such a policy is that it would protect the purchasing power of low and middle income households. Why is that important? It's not just important on bleeding hearts grounds, it's important in terms of the political durability or sustainability of the policy. If by some political miracle we were able to get a cap and trade policy like Waxman-Markey in place, and it were really to seriously raise prices to drive the clean energy transition that is so important, it would lead to those price increases at the pump that make that 18 cents federal gas tax look like a rounding error. You'd see significant, it would count in dollars, the price increases at the pump, advertised in every major street corner in America. And the political reaction to that, I think, would be substantial. I mean, we know it would be substantial. That's what Hillary and McCain were pandering to in their remarks back in 2008. And so do you think such a policy would remain in place for the 30 or 40 years it'll take to achieve the clean energy transition? As prices are driven higher and higher and higher, people are saying, oh, great, that's wonderful because we're saving the planet. Well, I'd like to think so, but you know what? Just because I like to think it doesn't necessarily mean I believe it's true. Whereas I think if you protect people's purchasing power so that when they show up at the gas pump and the prices hit $6, they don't say, oh my God, they're doing it again, them meaning the companies, the government, whoever's trying to pick my pocket. But rather they say 6 months, I can't wait to go collect my, or $6, I can't wait to go collect my dividend. That's a rather different political psychology. So the underlying philosophical principle here is one that I think is actually pretty widely shared on both sides of the American political spectrum, that is to say on the red side as well as the blue side, and widely shared indeed around the world. This is an inscription from a Diego Rivera mural that is translated as the earth is of all, it belongs to all of us, like the air, the water, the loos, and the light and the heat of the sun. And I think that's basically the philosophical principle on which the idea of returning the carbon revenue to the people rests. I think it's an appealing principle. I think it's an ethical principle that a lot of people can get behind. A lot of people would say that the gifts of nature, or what religious folk would call the gifts of creation, belong to us all. They're not the property of corporations. They're not the property of the government. They belong to us all. And this is a way of implementing that fundamental principle, which I think is really a good thing in and of itself. I also think trying to protect future generations from the impacts of potentially catastrophic anthropogenic climate change is also a good thing in itself. So this is, in a sense, a way to achieve two good things in one policy. If you're interested in reading more about it, this is an analysis of something called the CLEAR Act. Let me go back one slide. The woman in the cap and dividend picture, many of you probably won't recognize her, she's Senator Maria Cantwell from the state of Washington. And she and Senator Susan Collins from Maine jointly proposed in 2007 a cap and dividend bill. It was the only bipartisan climate bill. It was proposed in the last session of Congress. However, the Democratic leadership had decided to put all its eggs in the cap and giveaway and trade basket, and so it never made it out of committee. But it is, Cantwell is planning to reintroduce that bill, and again, attempting to do so in a bipartisan fashion with the hope, and I think it's not a totally unfounded hope, that there will be some Republicans who will be amenable to the idea of carbon pricing if they can go back to their constituents and not take the heat, so to speak, for having raised taxes and aggrandized the size of the government or corporate profits, but rather having instituted a policy that provides people with their share of America's climate wealth. This is an economic analysis that goes through and calculates the distributional impacts across deciles of the income distribution for all 50 states, taking into account differences in consumption behavior, the coal intensity of energy production, etc. Also offers some suggestions for how the public investment funds under that act would be distributed. That act is what sometimes is called a 175-25-0 bill. 100% auction, no giveaways, 75% back to the public as climate dividends, 25% into a clean energy trust fund for public investment, and 0 offsets, no offsets. So no way that you can avoid having to obtain and surrender a permit by claiming that you paid somebody not to cut down a forest somewhere or whatever. One of the uses of the trust fund money that is envisioned in the bill is for international assistance for adaptation and mitigation. But that's not as an offset, that's not instead of reducing our emissions, that's in addition to. If you're interested in the broad ideas about equal and common ownership of nature's wealth, let me unabashedly mention a book of mine that was published last month. There should be a paperback out in the fall where this and other examples of that approach are discussed. So thank you very much. Yeah.
So I have one really concrete question and one philosophical one. Concretely,
what kind was the
concrete?
Oh, concrete. Okay. Yep.
So capping and permit, allocation. Is that done every year, both in the giveaway and the auction, or is it done once and then you have the same level forever? If you're a firm.
I mean, the bills can handle this in various ways, but what you got, a key thing to understand is that the permit is not a permit to emit 1 ton of carbon per year or anything like that. The permit is to emit 1 ton of carbon. You want to emit another ton, you need to get another permit, right? Yeah. So usually the way these policies are defined is if it's a cap, there's a quantity of permits set for year 1, then there's a quantity set for year 2, for year 3, etc., and that quantity diminishes over time. The general kind of template being to achieve an 80% reduction below base year level, could be defined as 1990, 2010, 2013, whatever, by the year 2050. Often the schedule of reductions is, to my mind a little bit regrettably, kind of backloaded, so it starts off kind of easy and makes bigger reductions later on under the possibly optimistic view that once you have a policy in place, that'll stimulate R&D and investments that will make the bigger reductions later on less
so when it's cap and giveaway, when it's cap and auction, when you're auctioning, I can see how they just have to enter the auction every year.
Yeah, actually, Reggie auctions permits every quarter.
All right, so how about when it's given away? How do you know how much to give a firm every quarter for the next 40 years if you're giving them away?
So if you have a giveaway system, what you do is you again set the cap, right? So that's the total number of permits. And then you have some formula that allows you to decide, okay, this is how much we'll give to Josh's firm, this is how much we'll give to your firm, right? So that's what's happened, what has been achieved actually under the SO2 program that we've had now for more than 2 decades. A time frame was introduced, which was to reduce SO2 emissions by, as I recall, it was a 50% cut inside of 10 years, and they did it. And so they just, every year, they would reduce the total number of permits they gave away. And the formula was a little bit complicated. You know, there's a lot of political jockeying of it. There's a whole book written about it by a guy named Lee Raymond, if you're interested in the details. But basically, it was a grandfathering formula that gave away 98% of the permits and ended up retaining 2% to auction on the grounds that otherwise you'd be creating barriers to entry into the electricity sector, right? If you gave away all the permits, the firms could strategically hold on to them to prevent competition. So that was the way they did it. But you know, you apply the formula. The formula is basically shares, if it's a giveaway system, shares of the total pie that go to each individual enterprise, and you just multiply those shares by the total number of permits, and that gives you the number that the firm gets in a given year. What's the philosophical?
So the philosophical one is if it's going on in a place like California, and it's, let's say, cap and dividend, just a state or some subset of the world, that kind of implies that the citizens of California only are the ones who own the assimilation rights of carbon absorption in the atmosphere, where it obviously moves around, right? So Nevada's, and everybody on the planet's getting the cost of that emission. So is there sort of like a beneficiary problem there? And does anybody talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a scale issue, right? And in the end, of course, this is a global problem, and we actually need to have, you know, reductions in emissions and that mix of demand side and supply side policies all around the world, not just in California, not just in the United States. And the coordination problem of achieving that, particularly at the global level, has been, of course, one of the big impediments to a serious climate policy. When the Bush-Cheney regime refused to abide by the terms of the Kyoto Accord, one of their major arguments was, well, it's not fair because it doesn't affect the Chinese, and it's, why should we do it when they're not doing it? You know, they'll heat up the planet and we'll have higher energy prices, so why should we do this, right? So that is a problem, you know, that's a really big issue. One could philosophically imagine a global system of carbon capping and a global allocation of rights, and if one were to follow the logic of cap or fee and dividend and allocate those rights on an equal per capita basis, that would achieve a major redistribution of purchasing power around the world, because countries like the United States that have relatively profligate use of fossil fuels would be paying more than they would get back, and countries like Bangladesh or many countries in sub-Saharan Africa would be getting back a lot more than they're paying in. Personally, philosophically, I like that idea. Practically, I think it's a non-starter. For starters, we don't have a world government. Secondly, the political reaction in the United States would be, you know, possibly not as supportive, right? So I think as a stepping stone towards arriving at a national and ultimately an international policy, a very sensible way to do that is to create these cap and dividend or fee and dividend type systems in smaller jurisdictions, right? So that within any jurisdiction, California, the United States, you can implement a policy that is beneficial to the majority of the population on economic grounds alone, regardless of the extent to which it ultimately helps to leverage movement towards a global compact to reduce carbon emissions worldwide. So the benefits are up front and immediate and pocketbook benefits for most of the people. Of course, there are also important co-benefits in terms of reduction of emissions of other nasty stuff that are also, you know, this is another major issue that I haven't gone into, but I've done a lot of work on, is those public health co-benefits of climate policy, which are really potentially substantial. So the people of California get the co-benefits, they get the financial benefits. Whether the climate benefits ultimately materialize or not depends on to what extent that policy is ultimately taken up at the national level in the United States, and some sort of policies are taken up worldwide. The first piece I ever wrote on this kind of policy was about what would happen if you did it in China, and what the effects on poverty and income distribution would be in China, because I'm a development economist, actually, is my first hat. Politically, I think a realistic way, both in the short run, to achieve movement on policy to get some traction, and possibly even in the long run as a way to implement international policy, is rather than have one big pot into which everybody's paying and it's being redistributed worldwide, to have national pots where, you know, what's being paid for is the US share or the California share of the atmospheric space. And that's the money that's being recycled within the pond.
In the beginning of your talk, you sort of said that, you sell the auction, you auction the allowances, and then it doesn't really matter, you can return it through income tax or directly.
Well, I think it matters, but.
Well, that's what by the end of the talk, you drew a very bright line between dividend versus income tax rebate or something, and calling them actually different property rights. Like one, the property rights belong to the people and the other to the government, although the government's still mediating it. Is that mostly for political reasons, so everybody buys in? Because you were also showing graphs that show lower income people are more affected by the carbon tax, so shouldn't we return more money to lower income people who you would do that by income tax?
Well, who would benefit from the reductions in income and sales taxes if you have that tax shifting approach would, of course, depend on how you structure the system.
Exactly. I'm just
saying
you
could do it with lump sum payments that would transfer the same dollar amount to everybody through the income tax system. That's what the Swiss do. The Swiss have such a policy. It's not income tax. It reduces what they have to pay for their mandatory health insurance, but it's a lump sum that goes back to everybody. On the other hand, you could do it through simply cuts in the percentage rates across the board, like a sales tax cut would be, cut the sales tax from 5% to 4% or whatever, right? That would actually distribute more of the dividends to those who pay more in sales taxes or more in income taxes, right? So that would skew the benefits in terms of absolute dollar amounts towards upper income groups, as opposed to the very progressive distributional effect you get from equal lump sum redistribution. So the distributional effects of the two, of dividends versus returning the money to the public via the tax system, the difference between those hinges on how precisely the tax redistribution is designed. And it would be possible, as you're suggesting, to in fact deliberately skew that towards lower income groups. However, I think the main reason why dividends are a preferable way to do it, apart from kind of embodying that philosophical principle, making clear who the property rights belong to, if it's through this tax system, it's kind of like the government gives and the government takes away, right? Whereas this way, no, these belong to all of us. But politically, probably the more important rationale is the visibility of the return of the revenue, right? If you go to your ATM machine, stick the card in, and you see, okay, from the quarterly auction in March, I have $300 came into my dividend account. Do I want to withdraw it? Do I want to leave it in there? What do I want to do? That is really visible. People know the money's coming back to them. If you tell them, oh, it came back to you, and because we cut the taxes, or we, blah blah blah, I mean, most people's reaction is going to be, tell me another fairy tale. Well, who can understand why? There's so many things that affect the level of taxes. I'm going to take some politician's word for it that my taxes would have been even higher if I wasn't paying so much for gasoline at the pump. I just don't think politically it's going to get you the durable public support for the policy that is needed to maintain this policy for the 30 or 40 years it needs to be in place in order to achieve the transition. So I think to my mind, the overwhelming political case for the dividend payments is that people see them, right? And similarly, I think there's a political case for making them universal. In the same way that healthcare, Social Security, universal coverage, I believe, is really important for durable political support, right? Not only for embodying the principle of equal co-ownership of the resource, right? Whether you're rich or poor, but also for political popularity. If all I cared about was income redistribution, if I had a Rawlsian view, I would, fill the empty pots from the bottom up, transfer all the money to the very poorest people in the society to lift those boats, right? I mean, I can see, again, that's kind of the philosophical, I can see philosophical appeal of doing that, but what I want to really see is a policy that gets the U.S. to start reducing its carbon emissions. That's the bottom line, right? And I think, universal dividends to my mind, are far and away the most attractive and potentially feasible such policy.
So I think
Okay, so
I think we need to
Yeah.
pause and thank
Thank you.
Dr. Boyce for his really riveting lecture and good conversation. I know some of us will continue for a little bit further. So